ask with a question and a statement. Today, we're going to be talking about the 5 criteria. First of all, just a little funny word about English. Criteria is plural, and if you want to talk about one, you say criterion. It goes back to the Latin. So if you want to be really precise, there's a difference between a criterion, I-O-N, and criteria, which is the plural. Usually in English, of course, we use S for the plural. But in this particular case, it's the funny word like focus and foci, which also comes from the Latin, where we still use the plural. But here's my main point. What is a criterion? What is the difference between a criterion and a measurement? Who wants to answer that question?
In the chat Grace. From Grace. Okay.
Grace, go on. Tell me more. You said requirement. I'm putting you on the spot. Tell me more.
I feel like the word criteria, maybe not in, well, I just think like in regular context, a criteria is like required. Like what is the criteria to blank? Like anything. It's like a requirement to, like a prerequisite. Like a requirement for success or a requirement for a measurement. That's how I think of it.
You're in the right idea, okay? Does somebody else want to help Grace get a little closer? She's very close. What is a criterion? Yes, Erfani.
Criteria is a specific indicator. You can measure the growth based on that.
Very good. Anybody else want to talk about the idea? Everybody is getting very, very close. I'm so pleased. I've given you a hint when I use the word close. A criteria or, Melchade, do you want to say something, please? Yes.
Criteria is something we are going to refer to when we make measure. But the measure is to take what extent of something only. But criteria, we have to analyze situation and compare it to the criteria.
Very good. Okay, you all have come at this from different directions, and you're all right. But let's make sure we're using the term so that we all understand what the term is as we're about to begin this class. The way we use criteria and criterion in seed scale and almost universally in English is it's a standard. It's a standard to which you are measuring. It is a requirement, as Grace was also saying, to which you are going. It is typically something that you're trying to achieve and you're trying to measure your way towards that. Okay, so it's a criterion of excellence. It's a criterion of health. It's a criterion, and then we will, as we will be talking, we have 5 of them here. It's a standard. It's something to which you're seeking and to which you can measure how close you're getting. You probably will never get all the way. It's like the story about the person who's always getting halfway to something. Each time he goes halfway closer, each time halfway closer again, but you never quite get there. But it is giving you the standard to which you are attempting to change. It is a requirement that you get there. It is a measurement, as Melchiades said, okay? It's exactly what Erfani was saying. It's something to which we're trying to get to. It's a standard, okay? And so what in seed scale we're doing with the idea of criteria is that we're getting the standards for your society and your community, okay? And the general standard is prescribed by seed scale, but you make it specific. And more importantly, how you measure it, you may make specific in the projects you're doing. So I'm going to turn it over to Luke, and I think we're going to start with one of the most difficult ones and community specific ones, which is the criterion of inclusiveness. This differs for Grace in West Virginia, from Erfani in Afghanistan, Melchadi in Burundi. It's different for all of you, but it's the same standard to which you're trying to get to. The specifics will differ, the standard will remain the same. Luke, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel, and great framing of a concept that I think can come across as daunting at times, and it doesn't really need to. The 5 criteria in many ways they're so useful, and I think that often they, as is the case with most forms of measurement, they come across as intimidating. And so we want to today really start to pull down and kind of demystify these. And as Daniel said, with this whole concept of what is a criteria, it's a standard. And let's think of some other criteria that are outside of our 5 criteria. And I like to think of the term that we use. Think about the term perfect or perfection. Okay, that's something we all strive for when we bake, when we paint, when we create. But do we ever really hit it? Right? Because it's more of a standard that we're trying to get to. And there are elements of it that are very personal or subjective to us. But that doesn't mean that we don't try. And when we use that term, we all have a good understanding of what you mean by perfect or excellent. And so those are very, basic criteria that you use in your everyday language to describe experience. So what we want to do today is really look at all 5 of our criteria as a group and think of some real examples of how you would go about examples of what these criteria look like in different community contexts. And so we want to hear from all of you. But as Daniel mentioned, we're starting with inclusiveness. Now, in some of your readings, you may at times find the 5 criteria listed a little differently than the way they are listed in at least this week's reading. And that is because historically, if you read Empowerment on an Unstable Planet, at that time in seed scale, we called this criteria something different. We called it equity. And equity is very important, but what we realized is that equity as a criteria really made people think of finance and money and wealth and the distribution of wealth. But it's important to acknowledge with inclusiveness as a broader criteria, because it's important to acknowledge in society that power comes in many ways, shapes, and forms, and money is one of them. But so is religion and social structure. So is, unfortunately, race. We live in a world that is heavily prejudiced, and we need to acknowledge that in order to overcome it. And so this term inclusiveness, and then in your reading, the online lessons, it's something really important about inclusiveness, is that when you use inclusiveness as a criteria, it is the expectation. You are setting an expectation for future relationships. And so as you think about examples of this, often with inclusiveness, the area where inclusiveness becomes hard is we all get very defensive immediately. And we say, we're inclusive. We invited people. It's not our fault they didn't come. We tried. But the point is, great, I'm glad you tried. Keep trying. Because it's the expectation that your door should always be open, that you are inclusive by nature as opposed to exclusive. So let's think of some examples as a group of what inclusiveness looks like. How would you, in your community context, you all just analyzed 3 seeds and did great work on those assignments, really great work on those assignments. So based on that analysis, what does inclusiveness look like? How are you going to measure? What are you going to look at in your communities to gauge inclusiveness as a criteria, a standard to which you're all striving to achieve? Let's hear some examples. Irfani.
We can measure it based on gender in my community. For example, when we offering the education, is it only for the men or girl and women also? And also we can measure the inclusiveness based on poverty. The people they are using are the poor people or rich people or both, and based on race and based on language. It is a point in my country. And also we can say many other examples.
Thank you, Irfani. Several great examples. And certainly when you talk about specifically the beneficiaries, and we do throw those distinctions forward, the big ones being gender, wealth, and race. Of course, we also mentioned religion, but you brought up a very interesting one, which is language. And I think that one reason that that is so interesting is that doesn't just relate to who benefits, but it relates to how people can participate. So think about that. You can be inclusive in gender, poverty, and race, and still have that inclusivity, the inclusive aspects, be very passive. Well, anybody can benefit from this school. But are you willing to let those same groups help plan what's in the school? And when you start to look at some of these deeper indicators like language, you're not only getting to the more passive aspects of this, but you're getting to a key requirement for participation. Literacy falls when you talk about language, literacy for certain individuals. Actually, in most cases, you will be surprised, even those of you working in the United States, how questionable literacy can be in some of these communities of extreme poverty. Don't take that as a given. That's actually something I learned very recently. Let's hear a couple other examples. Meher, I saw you entered something in the chat.
Yeah, Meher has two good points that have been mentioned. So speak up, Meher.
Is your microphone working today? Meher, you need to unmute if you're. Oh, Meher is having extreme difficulty with his internet. So we bring up several that were also mentioned in the reading as well. Thank you. The religious background, sexual orientation, political orientation, and minorities. So absolutely. Let's talk about specifically this one I think is very interesting. It tends to be overlooked, which is political orientation, because that is increasingly, very, very unfortunately, a big issue everywhere.
Yeah, Herman was just talking about this in Bolivia, where they're having the national crisis because of this.
So who wants to help? Maher's brought up a really good example of how we can look at inclusiveness, but he doesn't have the microphone to describe it. So who wants to help Maher out and talk about this whole idea of political inclusiveness as it maybe manifests in your community? This is really interesting.
I don't know what Maher's political situations are like, but I can maybe relate to some of them here in West Virginia, which vary because of our population, that I guess our target participants are maybe more like politically differ from some of our what are we calling the people that stakeholders? But I think like the goal is the same, which is, you know, education and empowerment and, you know, all these great things that everyone wants, but sometimes I think that we have to put aside, which can be really difficult for some of our, well, on both sides, I think both sides have a difficult time, but when we realize like we want similar things, it's able to, I guess, you know, surpass those differences.
Great. Yeah, I think, you know, one of the issues here is we want all of us, if you're going to be effective in community, it's important to be politically engaged. And I salute anybody who decides to educate. I might not agree with their views, but be informed about the actual political process. There is a key distinction. They need to actually understand how politics works here. But but that's a really important point. And how do you, if in your personal life you're going to be politically active, how do you put those strong political feelings aside when it comes to community organizing and working together? I mean, in the United States, we just came out of a very, very bitter partisan election. And it was fascinating for me running a program in Appalachia where most of our participants have different political views than us. And we had to make really sure to separate those aspects of our life, because we very unconsciously in social media or whatever it might have been could have made ourselves seem inaccessible, whether it's that we seem elitist or just that they don't want to participate with us because they find our views alienating. And so this is a really good issue when you think about how do you be inclusive and participate in politics, but also how do you look beyond that so that you are creating a space in your community where it's clear that all views are welcomed and appreciated, as long as they speak from evidence, which is, I think, a common standard that's important to hold everyone to.
Gunjan made a very important point on caste. And one of the things that I've noticed, Gunjan, that's a very important point. It goes off of where Luke was headed. Everybody says, I'm open-minded and inclusive on caste. But almost always, they are not. It's one of those things where people pretend to be inclusive and then their internal biases. So I think this is leading to another point. I appreciate the comments that are coming in on the chat room, but let's get into this very interesting issue of caste. Those of you who don't live in a caste culture, I think you're all familiar with the idea.
Yes. So, and I think the important point that I'm going to keep coming back to about these criteria, and as the reading said on inclusiveness, it is that expectation for future relationships. So don't get too hung up on analyzing the past. Focus on the vision and where you want this criteria, because you're always going to need to work a little harder on making yourself more inclusive. Whether it's based on geography, that's one we haven't talked about, but is a big issue. Technology has overcome that to some degree, but also technology. Not everyone has it. Not everyone has equal access to connectivity and broadband. Unfortunately, I think we could all talk about inclusiveness the rest of the class, but we have 4 more criteria to get through. So now I'm going to hit one that hopefully people have some great answers to, because we hear it all the time. Sustainability. Who wants to talk about the seed scale aspect of sustainability? There are 3 specific parts. What does seed scale say sustainability needs to take consideration when you're looking at it as a criteria in community? Irfani.
sus- 3 important aspects of sustainability is economic sustainability, also environmental and cultural aspects.
Great. Yes. 3 parts. They're all very interlinked: economic, environmental, and cultural. And we often hear about sustainability couched within certainly economic terms. Can it make a profit? Can it sustain itself? And then some of the more enlightened folks or the environmental thinkers say, well, that's an environmental term, and we're talking about if our ecosystem can sustain. But you don't hear as much about cultural. So in case we don't have a lot of time to get to the other ones, I want to specifically dig in with this class discussion on what are some examples of cultural sustainability, and why is that so important to keeping the other 2 on track? What are some examples from your community?
Oh, in my community, one of the problems we have most with cultural sustainability is that, if it's not accepted by the group or accepted by the community, the initiative that we're working towards can sometimes just expire. So making sure that there's that collective effort behind is important.
I like the way you use the term expire to describe that, Kristen. That was very effective. Can you say a bit more about why you chose that term? Because I think if you meant where I think you were going, I think it's a very good example of, shall we say, passive resistance.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes if there's not enough effort behind it, or that person to kind of drive things, it has a little bit of a slow death and does kind of just expire, or even related to the economic portion. If it's a 3-year grant process, and then we make it to that 3rd year, then what happens? It just kind of poof, nobody knows what happens to it. So that's how I use that term.
Terrific. Thank you for sharing. And as Kristen said, we do see this. If you don't have the local cultural buy-in, sometimes you face resistance, but you also can face indifference. And people just don't participate. And what do we know? This is a class on scaling up. If people aren't going to participate, you've got a problem. Doesn't matter how much you're improving the quality of their life. What are some other good examples of how would you go about making sure that you are trying to track and use cultural sustainability? That's, Kristen was talking about how it can manifest itself when it doesn't work. What's an example of using it effectively that from your work or community?
Language comes to my mind again of like, I think in particular with English being the global language, maybe when that's not taken into account, kind of erasing or widening that gap of resources for those that don't speak English. And I don't know, language is a part of culture. And when that's not taken into consideration, it's no longer sustainable.
Sure. I mean, and this is where these criteria, they work in the reading, and you heard Daniel in the video describe them in our online lesson, describe them as similar to the 5 senses. And the two, they work together, right? Because if you're not culturally sensitive, if you're not culturally sustainable, what will you also not be? You won't be inclusive.
There's a very interesting role that festivals and cultural events can play. And the interesting thing is that most of these festivals, whether it's Dasai in Nepal, or whether it's Christmas in the United States, or whether it's New Year's in China, these are all usually festivals that remember something in the past, but they are a very powerful means of carrying culture forward. So to answer Luke's question, as you are trying to work about solutions, look at the role that festivals play. Look at the role that holidays play. Because this is something that people hold on to because they're fun.
Well, not just fun, they're profitable. And that's another piece of it. There are 3 parts of sustainability. Think about a harvest festival. Many cultures have them. Well, they're tracking the sustainability of their agriculture. They're celebrating that. They're having a good time. They're remembering the past while looking forward to the future. And trust me, there's a lot of money made all around. It's a gathering. Commerce is working. So festivals are a great example of this.
I think traditional knowledge and even the traditional healing practices is also one of the example of, like, you know, how the community could be culturally sustained, because then they have their own knowledge and their own practices. I think traditional knowledge
Very important. Traditional knowledge, and a very interesting thing comes because it's, people are believing traditional knowledge and modern knowledge at the same time. And so the question then becomes, what is right? And we want both to be right, because they're both part of our identity. So this gets into the role of science and the role of history and the role of identity. And the valuable thing about the 5 criteria that Luke has, that we have not mentioned, but I want to emphasize, is that there are 5 criteria. And you should not make one more important than the other, because we live in a complex world. So just like there are 3 ways of looking at sustainability, you need to be looking at all the 5 criteria. We used to have 6, and we decided that was just too many. And so 1 was taken out. But the important thing is you can put 1 back in too, if for your reasons you want to have. The point that I'm emphasizing here is multiplicity. Everything in life can be looked at from many directions. You can have many standards working at the same time. And Gunjan's point about traditional beliefs are a standard that we have to be attending to. So let's move to another criterion, because the beauty of all of this is with understanding that we've got many happening at the same time, and that's the real world.
Absolutely, Daniel. And with that being said, that's a perfect segue to the next criteria, which is holism. It very much relates to what Daniel was just saying about balance. Balance in your growth. Are you moving forward? Are you tracking from multiple perspectives? So holism, the easiest way to think about it, holism can be a confusing one. So the key to remember about holism is diversity. Okay, diversity of sectors. Are you growing holistically? We are humans and our needs are holistic. And so holism means, are you taking the whole perspective? And so what are some examples? Holism, this is an important one. We want to spend some time on holism. What is a good example of holism? You hear this term, you want growth to be holistic. What does that mean? Melchiade.
If a growth is holistic, if, for example, in education, advancement in education, there is advancement also in the health or in the farming sector. All sectors are in advancement. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Yes, is the interconnectedness. And we talk about interconnectedness a bit more in another criteria as well. But as we have talked about when you're talking about human growth, the blueprint models, they're all very much looking at one sector. But if we're starting from the human experience, you need to be making sure the quality of his life is advancing in a manner that is sustainable and inclusive of everyone's needs. This goes back to, how do you make sure you're being inclusive? How do you make sure you're being sustainable? Well, by being holistic. This is where they go together. Daniel, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say English is very funny on this situation, because the word whole, WHOLE, means complete. And the word whole without the W means empty. And when we use the word holistic, as we're doing now for our criterion, it doesn't have the W on the front, but it has the meaning of the W, because it's talking about whole being complete. I mean, there are some words in English, the word fulsome is the same one. Fulsome can mean full, or it can mean completely empty. We don't use fulsome very often, but we do use this word whole. And whole can be a whole, an empty place, or it can be the complete thing. And then when you spell it with enough. So my point simply is, for our purposes, you don't want to leave any holes in holistic.
So yeah, that got a little confusing, I will admit. So I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to give an example of holistic development, how it goes together, because we really want to make sure people are clear about this beyond the language. Okay.
Many years ago, I worked in Nepal in the family planning program. Okay, in the 1960s and 1970s. And my job in the family planning program was to promote contraception. Okay. And when I talked to Nepali women, they said, this is ridiculous that you're telling us not to have babies when we want to have babies. And not only do we want to have children, we want to have many children, because our children are going to die. And so you need to provide more than family planning services. You need to provide food services so our children don't die. You need to provide health services so our children live. You need to provide education so that the children have a future. You need to provide transportation because they want to leave the village and go to the city. That's holistic. When you give the children food and health and education and opportunities to travel. And my purpose that I was being paid to do was just one issue, which was to not have children and do contraception. And so the quality of life that I was being paid to advocate was actually causing a lowering quality of life for them. We have to look at things from many perspectives. They're all good. They all have to be balanced. Let's get Luke let's move to the other one, because at the end, we want to bring these all together in an iterative approach, right? Which is the issue of interdependence that you were just alluding to. Do you want to lead that one, Luke?
Sure. Well, or why don't you take interdependence, because you just primed the pump. But how is, I think the key question that many people might have is, how are interdependence and holism different?
Very important. The best way, one good way to understand interdependence is to focus on dependence. When you have dependency, typically you do not have holism. When you have dependency, what is happening is that you are having to concentrate in order to take care of that particular issue. And when you have interdependence, you're opening opportunities. Four classes ago, we talked about the definition of human development. And human development, which is what we're talking about here, okay? Seed scale, everything is under the umbrella of human development. And the great contribution from this scholar from Pakistan, Mahbubul Haq, who sort of was the leader in creating this understanding of what we call human development. And then it was picked up by Amartya Sen, is this idea of expanding choices. Really grab that idea. Your personal lives, your community lives will all be more sustainable, inclusive, holistic, and interdependent when you expand choices. So the idea of interdependence here is that you are creating many doorways. You're opening opportunity doors. You're getting interdependent. And the word is interdependent. They are becoming dependent on you, and you're opening opportunities to them. You're having many partnerships. A partnership is not when somebody's working just for you, it's when you're also working for them. Interdependent. So what you're trying to do in this criterion is you're trying to look at and measure the standard of opening doorways, opening opportunities. How do you do that? Give me some examples from your work of where you're opening these relationships.
Well, you think about Daniel's question, which we will come back to. I just wanted to build on what he was saying, because in your reading, it very clearly said, interdependence is the opposite of dependence. We want to avoid dependency. That's not a good word in development, dependency, because it means you're not going to be sustainable. And so the key question, or another way to think about Daniel's question, is, are you creating new connections? In holism, you ask, are all the needs being met? Or is everyone's priorities being met? But with interdependence, the key thing are you creating new connections? Those are the doorways Daniel was referring to.
Maher's got a very good point in the chat room. Rosie or Luke, you want to? I'm going to ask Rosie to riff on this a little bit. Take Maher's point, Rosie, and riff on it, because I know you've worked on this.
All right, so from Maher in the chat, we help kids/youth to improve their skills and learn new languages so they will be able to choose which field they want to evolve in and with whom they want to collaborate. So obviously this is opening up new opportunities for the participating children and youth. And it sounds like it's, mainly in the education sector, but it in fact is creating sort of a pipeline for these children to make impact later on in other fields and sectors. So that's a really cool example, Maher. I see another one from Herman talking about holism in Bolivia, where he is. So it's referring to building a strong relationship through communication, transportation, health, and educational sectors where adults and children all together are creating a strong and safe community in a given place in order to develop. So yeah, very clearly it's about interdependence between the different segments of community, between different functions that keep that community going, right, driving forward, as well as communities outside the community where you're working.
Yeah, so another way to think of this is, and this was also in the reading last night, but is, how does your community work with other communities? How do you all help one another? And think, community in the classic definition is, how does one town help another one? We can think of this through commerce or trade, but let's use our seed scale definition of community and think about, how do multiple groups of people that share something in common and have the ability to act together as individual groups, how do they now work across one another? This happens in economics and trade and production all the time. Somebody creates the raw materials, somebody else processes the raw materials. That's an interdependent system. And communities.
Looks like Grace poses a very good question here in the chat. Great. For interdependence, it seems like we want the members of the community to need each other, ? So that doesn't necessarily sound like a good thing. Luke, can you respond to that?
Well, Grace, let me turn the question back. Is it better to need your community members, or is it better to need a benefactor to save you from the top?
That's what I was thinking. We were talking about interdependence. I don't want the community to need our, NGO. Like, I want the community to need the children, or to need their elders, or to need their, whatever the members within that area is. Like you were saying, opening new doors. We don't. That seems like dependency when they need. I don't know.
Well, do folks remember the term from ACC 601, tensegrity?
It was here too. We learned about it.
We look at it as well in this course.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember exactly when some of these terms come up. Tensegrity is a good one. It's a term from agriculture. It's systems. It's when two different parts mutually hold one another up. Something like a yurt is a classic example of tensegrity architecture. When you put the whole system up, the pressure, it's mutually supportive, right? And so it's very strong when the whole system's in place because it holds one another up. But if you were to take a couple key parts of the system out, then it would need external support. And so once again, this is something that we are working on, right? This is where we want to get to in the future. But at its most simple, this is parts of our community helping one another, working together. So, Grace, I hear the point that you don't want to create, the goal is not to create dependency on you, Grace, but the goal is for members of your community to help one another and hold one another up. Does that make sense? All right, well, based on time, let's go. And great discussion, everybody. I wanted to slow down. Hopefully you've got a clear sense. If you have more questions about interdependence, go back and do read a few of the chapters on the 5 criteria, look at the readings again. But I think, the key question to understand that difference is when you're thinking of holism, you're looking at, are the conditions for growth being met? Whereas with interdependence, you're saying, are we forming new connections? Are we building outward as a system? As opposed to a hierarchy, or building a network or a hierarchy is a very good way of understanding. Interdependence is striving to get a network. We're that mutual support, that tensegrity. So the last criteria is iteration. What does iteration mean? Irfani.
Iteration mean doing something better than first time. For example, when I'm trying to learn how to speak and have a good speech in public, I try to do several times, but every time it will be better than past.
Exactly. So iteration is different from repetition because repetition is doing the exact same thing over and over again. Whereas iteration is doing the same thing over again while improving in each application. It kind of sums up the term practice makes perfect. That's what we mean by iteration. So let's think about iteration, because iterative process and iterative design, well, saw it in ACC 601 in our criteria, in our 7 tasks. We get to the final task and it says, learn from your mistakes and start over again. We looked at it at this exact criteria there in the cycle. It's the restart in our 7 tasks. So beyond how it works in the 7 tasks, how can you use this? What's an example of effectively using iteration as a criteria to guide your growth? Why iterate? Why would we have this as a criteria?
Because we need to improve our ability or skills, and we need to measure how I have a better skills or my ability is improved. Therefore, I do the same thing for several times, but I hope the every time I will do it better than the past.
Thank you, Irfani. Perfect. Exactly. We do iteration. Iteration's a criteria, and it's such an important criteria. It's not more important. It's balanced with the others. Because the whole point here is to improve things. Right? That's what we're doing. We're trying to make the quality of life better in our community for more people. Think of our feedback loop. Right? Participation improves because quality of life improves. Iteration is the part of quality of life improving. And Irfani used a very important term, measurement. Everyone in this class has heard me go on and on now in 2 different classes about the importance of evidence. This is what you use it for. You get evidence to learn from your mistakes and improve and get people to collectively do a little bit better job the next time. So I see we have some great comments coming in here on the chat. So let's hear from some of you folks. Matt, Grace, Meher, can any of y'all want to jump in here on iteration? It's really important. It's what it's all about.
I think for me, the work plan continues to show up throughout all of this, and particularly with iteration and tracking what you've done, what you can do better to then iterate on those things. And I think ultimately leading towards change and getting to look at what you've done to improve next time. I think that's all I have to say right now.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else want to jump in here and build on what Matt was saying? It's right on point.
In the chat from Albert, iteration gives confidence that we are advancing. Absolutely.
Exactly. So that's the question, Albert. That's a really good point. It gives confidence. The result of effectively using iteration is that the community is confident that they are getting better. So how do you measure that? How do you show iteration? Matt's brought up the work plan. Work plan's great. The reason the work plan is great is because it's written down, not necessarily because it tells you exactly what to do. But it shows the iterative process that you're learning from your mistakes. What are other easy ways to iterate in your work? As Irfani says, learning from mistakes. Learning from mistakes. You can't get perfection. I used perfection as a mock criteria at the beginning of this class because it's certainly what we're all striving for, but I don't think any of us expect our plan to be perfect when we roll it out. The only way to get closer to perfection is to keep working on it. So the important thing about iteration is not that you just change what you're doing all the time. The most important thing about, in order for iteration to really work effectively as a criteria, you need to measure it. And the way you measure it is through your evidence. It's that point of what did we find out? How are we tracking? And now how could we do that a little bit better? How could we make the quality a little bit better? How could we maybe diversify, make things more holistic? I mean, think about iteration. You can go back over, you use the other 4 criteria as a checklist. Are we sustainable? Are we inclusive? Are we holistic? Is life improving? Is participation? Is it inclusive? Anyone can participate. And then how can we get better at each of those? And we make iteration into its own criteria because that is really important. We often think that iteration just comes on its own. Well, do an analysis. Everyone will change their behaviors, right? Not everybody reads your analysis. Not everybody thinks changing behaviors is hard. So you want to make improving your application very simple, easy, and doable for everybody. Well, thanks everyone for a great class. As you notice, we actually saved our housekeeping because Daniel had an urgent reason, and we knew we would be losing him right towards the end of class. He had to slip away. So Rosie, I think there were a couple of housekeeping items related to assignments and whatnot. As we thank you once again, everyone who was able to get their assignment in on time. Terrific. We are trying to get feedback to everybody, but I just want to note before I hand it over to Rosie, very good job. We were bragging on what a great job you all were doing in faculty meeting the other day.
Absolutely. Yes, your assignments, really great work so far. Nearly all of you should have feedback at this point, unless your assignment was a little bit later, then you'll get that by end of today. But in terms of big picture, items, for the most part, everyone has selected really strong seeds. So I want to congratulate you. I know it's hard, especially this time around, because in a lot of cases, programming had to halt or shrink because of the pandemic. And now you're kind of looking to creatively grow that in either, get it back to its original glory or improve it in other more qualitative ways. In terms of the best things that I saw and things to be thinking about as you move on to further community lab assignments, it was really important that while you're describing this seed and analyzing it, that you achieved some level of clarity about what scaling up could look like. So it's one thing just pick an initiative, say, yeah, this is prime for growth, but how? Is that in terms of number of participants, number of the team members who are actively growing it? Is it by offering new services? So that's, I tried to give you feedback, coaching you to think through those questions. And really the strongest assignments, folks, were ones that you took time to illustrate the seed and its potential to scale up through photographs and through evidence. So really the strongest evidence that we saw was where you had to some extent already been gathering growth from the existing seed. Very obvious things like, when this started 3 years ago, there was only 2 members on the team. Now there's 9 members of the team, right? In some cases, you weren't far enough along to have that kind of evidence. So that's what we're hoping to coach you toward gathering for whichever seed you collect. Put those systems in place now so that, a couple months down the line, with the progress, and a couple of years down the line, that this in fact has been successful. So please, we're out of time, but I encourage all of you to go and look at the second community lab assignment, which we will get into more next week, but get a feel for what's to come. Be prepared to reach out or share any questions when we meet again next week. And thank you all for keeping up the great work.
Yes, Rosie, I really want to emphasize what Rosie just said. Please go away and today, in the next, before anybody, unless it's literally your bedtime, please go look at the next assignment. The next assignment's a little funny because we start it, then you have your break. We assume that during your break, your lab work will continue because your community work continues. But I don't want anybody, what we really don't want is for folks to get through break having not looked at and started their assignment. If you do that, you will be out of time. And I can promise you on the assignment, you really want to get rolling, have a plan in place for this assignment before you take a holiday or go on break. And specifically, start thinking about it while this assignment is fresh, because now you've analyzed 3 seeds, and the next assignment, the very first step is you need to pick one. So if you wait several weeks, you may have lost some of those really good ideas that you had about the analysis you just completed. So now that you've had a couple day break, pick up that next assignment, look at it, and start to mull it over. We will talk more about that next week. But thank you everyone for a great discussion. Really appreciate everyone's hard work.